After I survived a home invasion, my roommate tried to claim my settlement for emotional damages. I woke to the sound of glass breaking at 2:47 a.m. and knew immediately something was wrong. Not the confused disorientation of being pulled from sleep, but instant clarity that someone had just entered our apartment through the living room window. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand and dialed 911 while pressing myself against the wall beside my bedroom door. My hands shook so badly I could barely hold the phone steady. The dispatcher's voice came through asking for my emergency, and I whispered that someone had broken into my apartment. She asked if I was safe, and I said I didn't know. I could hear footsteps in the hallway outside my room, heavy boots on hardwood floors. My roommate Trevor's bedroom was on the opposite side of the apartment, and I prayed he'd locked his door like I'd been telling him to for months. The dispatcher told me to stay on the line and stay quiet. Police were being dispatched to my address. The footsteps stopped outside my door, and I watched the handle turn slowly. I'd locked it before bed, a habit Trevor made fun of me for. He said I was paranoid for locking doors inside our own apartment. The handle stopped turning, and someone pushed against the door, testing it. My heart was hammering so loud I was sure they could hear it through the wood. Then the footsteps moved away toward Trevor's room, and I heard his door open. He hadn't locked it. I heard Trevor shout, and the sound of struggling, furniture hitting walls. I made a decision that would define everything that came after. I unlocked my door and stepped into the hallway with my phone in one hand and a heavy bookend in the other. The dispatcher was saying my name, asking what was happening, but I couldn't respond. Trevor's door was open, and I could see a man in dark clothing standing over his bed. He was fighting back, hitting the intruder, shouting. I ran forward without thinking and swung the bookend at the intruder's head with everything I had. It connected with his skull, and he went down hard. Trevor scrambled off the bed, and we both ran for the front door. The man was getting back up behind us. We made it to the hallway outside our apartment, and Trevor was screaming for help. Doors opened on our floor, and neighbors came out. The man appeared in our doorway with blood running down his face from where I'd hit him. He looked at all the witnesses and ran the other direction, toward the fire escape at the end of our hall. By the time police arrived 3 minutes later, he was gone. They found the broken window and blood on Trevor's bedroom floor and in the hallway. They took our statements separately. I told them everything exactly as it happened. Trevor told them the man had been on top of him, and I'd saved his life by hitting him. The officers said we were lucky I'd woken up and been brave enough to intervene. They collected the bookend as evidence and took photos of everything. One officer asked if we had somewhere else to stay for the night, and Trevor immediately said we should go to his girlfriend Melissa's place. I didn't want to, but I also didn't want to stay in the apartment with a broken window and blood on the floor. Melissa lived in a converted loft downtown that cost more per month than our entire apartment. She answered the door in expensive pajamas and seemed more annoyed than concerned when Trevor explained what happened. She let us in and gestured toward the guest room without asking if I was okay. Trevor collapsed onto her sofa, and she held him while I stood there feeling invisible. I went to the guest room and sat on the bed trying to process everything. My hands were still shaking. I could still feel the impact of the bookend hitting the intruder's skull, could still hear Trevor shouting. I didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, Melissa made coffee for herself and Trevor, but didn't offer me any. They sat at her kitchen island discussing what happened, like I wasn't in the room. Trevor kept saying he couldn't believe someone had broken into our apartment and attacked him. Melissa said she'd been telling him for months to move out of that neighborhood because it wasn't safe. I pointed out that the man had climbed through our living room window, which faced an alley we shared with expensive brownstones. This wasn't a neighborhood crime issue. Melissa looked at me for the first time and said, maybe I shouldn't have left the window unlocked. I told her I'd checked all the windows before bed. He'd broken the glass to get in. Melissa said it was still concerning that our security was so poor and Trevor should move in with her. Trevor looked at me and said he might need to do that because he didn't feel safe anymore. I asked if he was breaking our lease, and he said he'd have to think about what was best for his mental health. I went back to our apartment alone that afternoon. The landlord had boarded up the broken window temporarily and said he'd have it replaced within the week. I walked through each room, checking every lock and window. Everything was secure except for the glass the intruder had broken. I cleaned Trevor's room because I couldn't stand looking at the blood and the disturbed furniture. His bed was pushed away from the wall, and his nightstand was knocked over. I set everything right and changed his sheets and tried not to think about what would have happened if I hadn't woken up. Trevor came back that evening with Melissa and 2 large suitcases. He said he was packing some things to stay with her for a while until he felt safe again. I asked how long a while meant, and he said he didn't know. Melissa stood in our living room looking at everything like it was contaminated. Trevor packed for an hour, taking most of his clothes and toiletries. Before he left, he hugged me and said, "Thank you for saving his life." He was shaking, and I told him it was okay, and he was safe now. Melissa didn't say anything to me. They left, and I was alone in the apartment. The police called 2 days later to say they'd identified the suspect from DNA in the blood I'd drawn when I hit him. His name was Kyle Brennan, and he had a record for burglary and assault. They'd issued a warrant for his arrest but hadn't located him yet. The detective asked if I'd be willing to testify if the case went to trial, and I said yes. He said they'd be in touch and to call immediately if I saw anyone suspicious around my apartment. I went back to work at the medical billing company, where I processed insurance claims in a cubicle for 8 hours a day. My coworkers had heard about the break-in because I'd had to take 2 days off and my supervisor had asked for an explanation. Everyone wanted details, and I gave them the basic facts without elaborating. One woman said I was incredibly brave, and she didn't think she could have done what I did. Another said I was lucky the intruder didn't have a gun. I hadn't thought about that possibility until she mentioned it, and then I couldn't stop thinking about it. Trevor texted me occasionally asking how I was doing and whether police had caught the guy yet. He never mentioned coming back to the apartment or paying his half of rent. After 2 weeks, I texted him asking about rent, and he said Melissa was helping him with expenses right now because he was too traumatized to work. I asked if he was planning to move back, and he said he didn't think he could ever live in that apartment again after what happened. I told him our lease had 6 months remaining, and he was still responsible for his portion. He said he'd talked to his dad about it and stopped responding. Trevor's father called me 3 days later. His name was Graham Sutherland, and he spoke with the kind of authority that came from decades of getting his way. He said he understood there'd been an unfortunate incident at the apartment, and Trevor was deeply traumatized. I said I understood that. He said, given the circumstances, he thought it was reasonable for Trevor to be released from the lease without penalty. I said I didn't have the authority to release him from anything, and he'd need to discuss it with our landlord. Graham said he'd already spoken with the landlord who'd agreed to let Trevor out of the lease if I found a new roommate or paid the full rent myself. I said that wasn't what we'd agreed to when we signed the lease together. Graham said circumstances had changed, and Trevor's mental health had to be the priority. I asked if he understood that I'd been there too, and had actually fought the intruder while Trevor ran. Graham said he appreciated what I'd done, but Trevor was the one who'd been attacked in his bedroom. I told him I'd think about it, and ended the call. The landlord confirmed that Graham had called and offered to pay a lease termination fee if I'd agree to release Trevor from his obligations. The amount was 2 months' rent, which wouldn't even cover the cost of finding and vetting a new roommate on short notice. I told the landlord I didn't agree to release him, and he said that was my right, but I should know that Graham Sutherland was a prominent attorney and was considering legal action. I asked on what grounds, and the landlord said something about mental health accommodations and uninhabitable conditions. I said the apartment was perfectly habitable, and one broken window that had been immediately repaired didn't constitute uninhabitable conditions. The landlord said he didn't want to get involved in a dispute between roommates, and I'd need to work it out with Trevor directly. I tried calling Trevor, and he didn't answer. I sent him multiple texts explaining that I couldn't afford the full rent alone, and he was legally obligated to pay his share. He responded once, saying his therapist had advised him to avoid stressful communication while he processed his trauma. I was processing trauma too, but apparently mine didn't count because I hadn't been the one in bed when it happened. Kyle Brennan was arrested 5 weeks after the break-in. Police found him staying at a friend's apartment across town. The detective called to tell me he'd been charged with burglary, assault, and attempted sexual assault, based on the evidence and Trevor's statement. I asked what Trevor had said in his statement, and he told me that information was part of the investigation. The detective said the district attorney would be in touch about trial proceedings. I asked when that might be, and he said these cases typically took months to get to trial. In the meantime, I should continue taking normal precautions and call if I felt unsafe. I'd felt unsafe every night since the break-in, but telling the detective that wouldn't change anything. I installed additional locks on my bedroom door and window. I bought pepper spray and kept it on my nightstand. I slept with lights on and woke up at every sound. My work performance suffered because I was exhausted and couldn't concentrate. My supervisor called me in for a meeting about my declining productivity, and I explained I was dealing with aftermath from a violent crime. She said she understood, but the company had standards to maintain, and I needed to find a way to manage my personal issues without impacting my work. I asked if there was any employee assistance program or counseling available, and she said I could use my health insurance to find a therapist, but the company didn't provide additional support. I looked into therapy and found that my insurance covered 10 sessions per year with a copay of $50 per session. I was already struggling to pay full rent without Trevor's contribution and couldn't afford an extra $200 per month for therapy. Graham Sutherland sent me a formal letter through his law firm 6 weeks after the break-in. The letter stated that Trevor had suffered severe psychological trauma as a result of the attack in the apartment and was unable to return to the premises without experiencing debilitating anxiety and panic attacks. The letter cited medical documentation from Trevor's therapist and psychiatrist supporting his claim of trauma. It stated that requiring Trevor to continue paying rent for an apartment he could no longer occupy due to circumstances beyond his control constituted unreasonable hardship. The letter demanded that I release Trevor from all lease obligations immediately or face potential legal action for inflicting emotional distress by insisting he maintain financial responsibility for a location of his trauma. I read the letter 3 times trying to understand how I'd become the villain in this situation. I'd saved Trevor from being attacked. I'd fought off an intruder while he ran. I'd cleaned up the blood and fixed his room and continued living in the apartment that apparently traumatized him so badly he couldn't even pay rent, and now his father was threatening to sue me for emotional distress because I expected him to honor a legal contract we'd both signed. I took the letter to a legal aid clinic that offered free consultations. The attorney who reviewed it was a young woman named Rachel Park who looked barely old enough to have passed the bar. She read Graham's letter carefully and asked me to explain the full situation from the beginning. I told her everything, including the break-in, Trevor moving out, the rent dispute, and Graham's involvement. Rachel said the letter was essentially an intimidation tactic, designed to pressure me into giving up my legal rights. She said Trevor was still bound by the lease regardless of his emotional state, and Graham knew that. The threat of a lawsuit for emotional distress was baseless because I hadn't done anything to cause Trevor distress. The intruder had caused the distress, and he was the appropriate target for any civil claims. Rachel said I should respond to the letter stating that I wouldn't release Trevor from the lease, and he remained responsible for his portion of rent until the lease expired or he found an acceptable replacement roommate. I asked what would happen if Graham actually followed through with a lawsuit, and Rachel said it would be dismissed almost immediately, but defending myself would still require time and potentially money. She said people like Graham counted on that intimidation factor to get what they wanted without ever going to court. I sent a response letter drafted with Rachel's help, stating my position clearly and citing the relevant lease provisions. Graham responded through his firm within days with an even more aggressive letter threatening multiple causes of action, including negligent infliction of emotional distress, breach of implied warranty of habitability, and intentional interference with Trevor's right to quiet enjoyment of the premises. The legal language was impressive, but Rachel said it was still baseless posturing. She said Graham was throwing everything at the wall, hoping something would stick or I'd get scared and give up. I wasn't scared anymore. I was angry. Trevor had been my friend before he was my roommate. We'd met through mutual connections and bonded over similar interests and sense of humor. He'd seemed genuine and reliable when we'd decided to get an apartment together. But the moment things got difficult, he'd abandoned me financially and emotionally, then sent his attorney father after me when I asked him to honor his commitments. The district attorney's office contacted me about giving a deposition for Kyle Brennan's preliminary hearing. I met with a prosecutor named Lisa Thornton, who was handling the case. She was in her 40s with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. Lisa explained that Kyle was facing serious charges and had rejected a plea deal, so the case was going to trial. She said my testimony would be crucial because I was the only witness to the actual assault. I asked about Trevor's testimony, and Lisa's expression changed slightly. She said Trevor had given a statement to police immediately after the incident, but had since revised several details through his attorney. I asked what that meant, and Lisa said Trevor was now claiming the attack had been more severe than initially reported, and he'd suffered injuries that required ongoing medical treatment. Lisa showed me Trevor's revised statement, which described the intruder pinning him down and assaulting him violently before I intervened. The original police report from that night said Trevor had struggled with the intruder and escaped when I hit him. The timeline was seconds, not minutes. Lisa asked if I remembered anything that supported Trevor's revised version, and I said no. I remembered exactly what I'd seen, and it matched the original police report, not the new statement. Lisa made notes and said she'd need me to testify to exactly what I observed without embellishment. She said defense attorneys often tried to create doubt by highlighting inconsistencies between witness statements, and I needed to be absolutely certain of my account. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for 3 months after the break-in. I took the day off work and went to the courthouse downtown. Trevor was there with his father and Melissa. He was wearing a conservative suit and minimal expression, looking vulnerable and traumatized. He didn't make eye contact with me. Graham saw me and his expression hardened. He walked over and said he hoped I'd reconsidered my position on the lease situation. I said I hadn't. He said that was unfortunate because things were about to get very complicated for me. I asked what he meant, and he said I'd find out soon enough. Lisa Thornton pulled me aside before the hearing and said Graham had filed a civil lawsuit on Trevor's behalf against Kyle Brennan for assault, battery, and emotional distress. I said that made sense given what happened. Lisa said the lawsuit also named me as a defendant, claiming I'd been negligent in securing the apartment and had contributed to Trevor's trauma by forcing him to relive the incident through the criminal proceedings. I asked how I'd forced him to do anything, and Lisa said the lawsuit claimed I'd pressured Trevor to testify in a way that minimized his trauma in order to protect myself from liability. I said that was completely false, and Lisa said she knew that, but I'd still need to defend myself against the claims. She gave me the business card of a civil attorney who might be able to help. The preliminary hearing took 2 hours. Kyle Brennan looked different in person than I'd expected. He was younger, maybe mid-20s, and seemed almost bored by the proceedings. His public defender argued that the evidence was circumstantial, and there was reasonable doubt about his intent when entering the apartment. The prosecutor presented the DNA evidence from the blood, the broken window, and the testimony from both Trevor and me. I testified first, describing exactly what I'd seen and done. Trevor testified after me, and his account had changed again. He now said the intruder had been on top of him for several minutes before I intervened and had said threatening things to him. He said he'd thought he was going to die or worse. Lisa asked how long Kyle had been in his room before I intervened. Trevor said it felt like forever, but was probably 2 or 3 minutes. Lisa asked if he was certain about the timeline. Trevor said trauma made time feel different, but he was certain it had been several minutes. Lisa asked what specific actions Kyle had taken. Trevor said he'd held him down, covered his mouth, groped his chest, and attempted to remove his clothing. Lisa asked if he'd succeeded in removing any clothing. Trevor said he'd pulled his shirt partially up before I'd hit him. Lisa asked if he'd sustained any injuries. Trevor said psychological injuries and some bruising on his arms from being held down. Lisa asked if he'd seen a doctor about the injuries. Trevor said he'd been too traumatized initially, but had sought medical help later. Lisa thanked him, and the defense attorney took over cross-examination. The judge found sufficient evidence to bind Kyle over for trial and set a trial date 6 months out. After the hearing, Graham approached me in the courthouse hallway and handed me papers. I'd been officially served with the civil lawsuit. The complaint was 30 pages long and detailed Trevor's suffering in graphic terms. It claimed I'd been negligent by not maintaining adequate security measures, including failing to install window locks and failing to wake up sooner when the intruder entered. It claimed I'd inflicted additional emotional distress on Trevor by demanding rent payment and forcing him to maintain connection to the site of his trauma. The lawsuit sought damages of $500,000 from Kyle Brennan and $50,000 from me. I couldn't afford an attorney to defend a $50,000 lawsuit. I contacted Rachel from the Legal Aid Clinic, and she said their organization couldn't represent me in civil cases of this complexity, but she'd try to connect me with someone who might take the case pro bono or on contingency. I spent 2 weeks calling different attorneys and explaining my situation. Most said they didn't take cases against other attorneys, especially not prominent ones like Graham Sutherland. Several said I should try to settle because fighting would cost more than paying. One attorney named David Ortega finally agreed to review the case. He was in his 60s, semi-retired, and said he'd dealt with Graham before on other matters. David read through all the documentation, including the police reports, lease agreement, Graham's threatening letters, and the civil complaint. He said the lawsuit was frivolous and clearly designed to pressure me into releasing Trevor from the lease and possibly to extract money from Kyle Brennan's eventual settlement or judgment. I asked if we could get the case dismissed, and David said we could file a motion, but judges were often reluctant to dismiss claims involving trauma without letting them proceed to discovery. He said the better strategy might be to flip the situation entirely. I asked what he meant, and David said if Trevor was claiming ongoing severe trauma from the break-in, then he was entitled to pursue damages from Kyle Brennan. But by that same logic, I was also entitled to pursue damages because I'd been present, fought the intruder, and suffered my own trauma from the incident. David said we should file a cross-claim against Trevor for his portion of unpaid rent and a counterclaim against both Trevor and Graham for malicious prosecution and abusive process. More importantly, we should file our own lawsuit against Kyle Brennan for my damages, including emotional distress, medical expenses for therapy I couldn't afford, and lost wages from decreased work performance. David said if there was going to be a settlement or judgment from Kyle, I had just as much right to a portion as Trevor did. Maybe more, given that I'd actually fought him while Trevor ran away. I asked how much this would cost, and David said he'd take my case on contingency. If we won or settled, he'd take a percentage. If we lost, I'd owe nothing. He said he was doing this partially because he didn't like Graham's tactics, and partially because he believed my case was stronger than Trevor's, despite his father's legal maneuvering. David filed all the motions and complaints within 2 weeks. The counterclaim against Trevor and Graham alleged malicious prosecution, abusive process, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and breach of contract for the unpaid rent. The separate lawsuit against Kyle Brennan alleged assault, battery, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and negligence. David sent copies to Lisa Thornton at the DA's office, so she'd be aware of the parallel civil proceedings. Graham's response was immediate and furious. He called David directly and threatened to file a bar complaint for frivolous litigation. David told him to go ahead and noted that Graham's own lawsuit met every definition of frivolous, but David hadn't filed complaints yet. Graham said this was going to destroy my credibility as a witness in the criminal case. David said threatening a crime victim into silence was witness intimidation, and he'd be happy to add that to our claims if Graham wanted to continue. The call ended badly. Trevor called me for the first time in months. He was upset and said he couldn't believe I was suing him after everything he'd been through. I said I couldn't believe he was suing me after I'd saved him from being attacked. He said he wasn't trying to hurt me, he just needed to hold the right people accountable for what happened. I asked if he considered me one of the right people, and he said his therapist and father both believed I'd contributed to his ongoing trauma by not being more supportive. I asked how I'd been unsupportive, and he said by demanding rent money and questioning his revised memories of the attack. I told him I'd questioned his revised memories because I'd been there and knew what actually happened. He said trauma survivors often recovered memories over time, and I was victimizing him all over again by suggesting he was lying. I said I wasn't suggesting he was lying. I was stating factually that his current account didn't match what I'd witnessed. He said maybe I didn't remember correctly because I'd been half asleep and in shock. I said I'd been fully awake and clear-headed enough to save his life. Trevor said he had to go and hung up. That conversation confirmed what I'd suspected. Trevor had convinced himself of a different version of events that positioned him as the sole victim and me as either irrelevant or complicit. His therapist and father were reinforcing this narrative, and he'd lost the ability to distinguish between recovered memories and constructed ones. The civil cases and criminal case moved forward on parallel tracks for the next several months. Kyle Brennan's attorney tried to get my testimony excluded from the criminal trial, claiming I was biased because of the civil lawsuit. The judge denied the motion. Graham tried to get David disqualified from representing me, claiming conflict of interest. The judge denied that motion too. Both sides took depositions. I was deposed by Graham himself in a conference room at his law firm. He spent 4 hours trying to catch me in contradictions or get me to admit I'd been negligent. I answered every question truthfully and consistently. My story never changed because it was the truth. Graham asked if I'd been drinking the night of the break-in. I said no. He asked if I'd taken any medications that might have impaired my perception. I said no. He asked why I'd locked my bedroom door if I didn't suspect danger. I said I always locked my door out of habit. He asked why I hadn't warned Trevor to lock his door. I said I'd told him multiple times over the months we'd lived together and he'd made his own choices. Graham asked if I blamed Trevor for being attacked. I said I blamed Kyle Brennan for breaking into our apartment and attacking him. Graham asked if I felt I deserved recognition for intervening. I said I didn't intervene for recognition, I intervened because someone was hurting my friend. Graham asked if I considered Trevor my friend now. I said I didn't know what I considered him anymore. David deposed Trevor at his office. I sat in on the deposition and watched Trevor struggle to keep his stories straight. David asked him to describe the attack in detail, and his description kept shifting. First he said it lasted several minutes, then he said he wasn't sure of the timeline, then he said it felt like forever but might have been shorter. David asked what specific injuries he'd sustained, and he said psychological injuries and some bruising. David asked for medical records documenting the bruising. Graham objected to the relevance. David said if Trevor was claiming physical assault, there should be medical evidence. Trevor said he'd been too traumatized to see a doctor immediately after. David asked when he'd eventually seen a doctor. He said 3 weeks later. David asked what the doctor had documented. Graham instructed him not to answer, claiming medical privilege. David said privilege didn't apply when medical conditions were central to the lawsuit claims. The judge later ordered Trevor to produce all medical records related to the incident. The records showed 1 visit to a therapist 2 weeks after the break-in, and 1 visit to a psychiatrist who'd prescribed anti-anxiety medication. No documentation of physical injuries or immediate psychological crisis. Kyle Brennan's criminal trial was scheduled first. It took place 8 months after the break-in in a downtown courthouse. I'd been subpoenaed as a prosecution witness. Trevor had also been subpoenaed. The jury selection took 2 days. The actual trial took a week. Lisa Thornton presented the prosecution's case methodically. She showed photos of the broken window and blood evidence. She presented DNA analysis confirming the blood belonged to Kyle. She called the police officers who'd responded that night. She called neighbors who'd seen Kyle running from our building. Then she called me to testify. I took the oath and sat in the witness box looking out at the courtroom. Kyle sat at the defense table looking bored again. Trevor sat in the gallery with Melissa and Graham. The jury watched me carefully. Lisa asked me to describe what happened the night of the break-in. I described waking to the sound of breaking glass, calling 911, hearing footsteps, seeing my door handle turn, hearing Trevor shout, making the decision to leave my locked room and intervene. I described what I'd seen when I looked into Trevor's bedroom. Kyle on top of Trevor who was fighting him off. I described hitting Kyle with the bookend and both of us running from the apartment. Lisa asked how long I'd observed Kyle in Trevor's room before hitting him. I said approximately 2 to 3 seconds, just long enough to process what was happening and react. Lisa asked if Kyle had been assaulting Trevor when I entered. I said he was on top of him and Trevor was fighting him, but I couldn't specify what exactly he'd been doing in those 2 to 3 seconds. Lisa asked if I'd seen any weapons. I said no. Lisa asked if Kyle had said anything. I said no. Lisa asked how I'd felt in that moment. I said terrified and desperate to stop what was happening. Lisa thanked me and turned me over to the defense attorney. Kyle's attorney was a middle-aged man named Robert Fisher, who specialized in defending violent criminals. He approached me with a skeptical expression and asked if I'd been fully awake when I heard the glass breaking. I said yes. He asked how I could be certain I was fully awake. I said because I'd immediately called 911 and given the dispatcher coherent information. Fisher asked if I'd been having any dreams before waking. I said I didn't remember my dreams that night. Fisher asked if it was possible I'd been in a confused state between sleeping and waking. I said no, I'd been completely alert. Fisher asked why I'd locked my bedroom door if I hadn't suspected danger. I said I locked my door every night out of habit. Fisher asked if I'd warned my roommate to lock his door. I said I'd suggested it many times. Fisher asked if I'd checked to ensure he'd locked it that night. I said no. Fisher asked if I felt responsible for what happened to Trevor. I said I felt responsible for stopping it from being worse. Fisher asked me to describe exactly what I'd seen in Trevor's bedroom. I repeated my earlier testimony. Kyle on top of Trevor, him fighting back, my intervention. Fisher asked if I'd seen Kyle strike Trevor. I said no. Fisher asked if I'd seen Kyle remove any of Trevor's clothing. I said no. Fisher asked if I'd seen Kyle touch Trevor inappropriately. I said I'd seen him on top of him, but I couldn't describe specific actions in the 2 to 3 seconds before I hit him. Fisher asked if it was possible Kyle had simply been trying to restrain Trevor to prevent him from attacking. I said that made no sense, given that he'd broken into our apartment. Fisher asked if I'd actually seen Kyle break the window. I said no, but the window had been intact when I went to bed and broken when police arrived. Fisher asked if I'd personally inspected every window before bed. I said I'd checked the living room window, which was the one that ended up broken. Fisher asked if I'd locked it. I said I'd confirmed it was locked. Fisher asked how someone could break a locked window to enter. I said, by breaking the glass and reaching through to unlock it, which is what appeared to have happened. Fisher asked if I had proof that's what happened. I said the broken glass and unlocked window when police arrived was proof. Fisher asked if I'd considered that the window might have already been unlocked. I said no, because I'd checked it. Fisher was trying to create doubt about Kyle's intent and my credibility. It wasn't working. The jury looked annoyed by his implications. Fisher asked if I had any financial interest in the outcome of this trial. I said I wanted justice for what happened. Fisher asked if I'd filed a civil lawsuit against his client. I said yes. Fisher asked if I stood to gain money if his client was convicted. I said I stood to gain some measure of justice and possibly compensation for damages. Fisher asked if that financial motivation might color my testimony. I said my testimony was factual regardless of any civil proceedings. Fisher asked if I'd coordinated my testimony with Trevor. I said no. Fisher asked if Trevor and I had discussed the events after they occurred. I said yes immediately after while waiting for police. Fisher asked if we'd discussed them since. I said not in detail. Fisher asked why not. I said because Trevor had moved out and we weren't in regular contact anymore. Fisher asked if we'd had a falling out. I said we'd had disagreements about financial obligations. Fisher asked if I was angry with Trevor. I said I was disappointed in how he'd handled things after the break-in. Fisher asked if that disappointment might make me want to minimize his trauma in my testimony. I said I wasn't minimizing anything, I was stating what I'd observed. Fisher had no more questions. Lisa called Trevor to testify next. Trevor took the stand, looking pale and nervous. He described waking to someone in his room and realizing it was an intruder. He said he'd shouted and fought back, but Kyle had been too strong. He said he'd pinned him down on the bed and put his hand over his mouth. He said he'd thought he was going to die or worse. He said Kyle had been trying to remove his clothing when I'd appeared and hit him. Lisa asked how long Kyle had been in his room before I intervened. Trevor said it felt like forever, but was probably 2 or 3 minutes. Lisa asked if he was certain about the timeline. Trevor said trauma made time feel different, but he was certain it had been several minutes. Lisa asked what specific actions Kyle had taken. Trevor said he'd held him down, covered his mouth, groped his chest, and attempted to pull down his pants. Lisa asked if he'd succeeded in removing any clothing. Trevor said he'd pulled his shirt partially up before I'd hit him. Lisa asked if he'd sustained any injuries. Trevor said psychological injuries and some bruising on his arms from being held down. Lisa asked if he'd seen a doctor about the injuries. Trevor said he'd been too traumatized initially but had sought medical help later. Lisa thanked him and Fisher took over. Fisher asked Trevor to describe Kyle's appearance when he was in his room. Trevor said he couldn't see clearly, because it was dark. Fisher asked how he knew it was Kyle, if he couldn't see clearly. Trevor said he'd seen him when they'd run into the hallway with lights on. Fisher asked if he'd identified Kyle to police that night. Trevor said yes, from photos. Fisher asked if he'd been certain of the identification. Trevor said yes. Fisher asked about his timeline again. He pointed out that his initial police statement said the attack lasted seconds before I intervened. Trevor said he'd been in shock and hadn't remembered everything clearly that night. Fisher asked when his memory had improved. Trevor said over weeks and months in therapy. Fisher asked if his therapist had helped him recover memories. Trevor said his therapist had helped him process what happened. Fisher asked if the therapist had suggested details he might have forgotten. Trevor said the therapist had asked questions that helped him remember. Fisher asked if those questions might have influenced his memories. Trevor said no, he remembered what actually happened. Fisher asked why his current account was so different from his initial statement. Trevor said trauma affected memory, and he'd blocked things out initially for self-protection. Fisher asked about the civil lawsuit. Trevor confirmed he'd filed suit against Kyle and against me. Fisher asked why he'd sued me. Trevor said, because I'd been negligent in securing the apartment and had made his trauma worse afterward. Fisher asked how I'd made it worse. Trevor said by demanding rent money and questioning his memories. Fisher asked if he'd paid his share of rent after moving out. Trevor said no because he couldn't return to the apartment. Fisher asked if he was still legally obligated under the lease. Trevor said his father was handling that. Fisher asked if his father was an attorney. Trevor said yes. Fisher asked if his father had helped him prepare his testimony. Trevor said he'd discussed the case with him. Fisher asked if he'd told him what to say. Trevor said no. Fisher asked if he'd suggested his memories might be more severe than initially reported. Trevor said he'd encouraged him to be honest about his full experience. Fisher asked if being honest meant changing his story. Trevor said it meant telling the complete truth as he remembered it now. Fisher asked if the complete truth happened to support a $500,000 lawsuit. Lisa objected. The judge sustained it. Fisher asked if Trevor had any proof of the details he'd added to his account. Trevor said his word was proof. Fisher asked if there were medical records documenting immediate injuries. Trevor said he'd already testified about seeing doctors later. Fisher asked why he'd waited weeks to see a doctor if he'd been so severely traumatized. Trevor said he'd been in denial and processing. Fisher asked if denial and processing might also explain why his memories kept changing. Trevor started getting emotional. The judge called a recess. During the break, Lisa told me Trevor's testimony had been problematic. The inconsistencies were obvious, and Fisher had exploited them effectively. Lisa said she still believed the jury would convict based on the physical evidence and my testimony, but Trevor's constantly shifting story had created doubt about the severity of the attack. Lisa said this happened sometimes with trauma victims, but it made prosecution more difficult. The trial resumed, and both sides gave closing arguments. Lisa emphasized the broken window, the DNA evidence, Kyle's criminal record, and the fact that he'd fled the scene. She said the evidence proved Kyle had broken into our apartment and assaulted Trevor. Fisher emphasized the inconsistencies in Trevor's testimony and questioned whether Kyle had intended to assault him or had simply panicked when he'd shouted. He said reasonable doubt existed about Kyle's specific intent, and the jury should acquit on the more serious charges. The jury deliberated for 6 hours and returned with a verdict. Guilty of burglary. Guilty of assault. Not guilty of attempted sexual assault. The jury had believed Kyle broke in and attacked Trevor, but hadn't been convinced by his testimony about the sexual nature of the attack. Lisa looked frustrated. Trevor looked devastated. Graham looked furious. Kyle looked relieved. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for a month later. Kyle faced up to 10 years for the burglary and assault convictions. Lisa asked me to provide a victim impact statement describing how the break-in had affected my life. I wrote 3 pages about sleepless nights, constant fear, panic attacks, inability to concentrate at work, financial stress from paying full rent alone, and the betrayal of being sued by someone I'd saved. The judge read my statement at sentencing, along with Trevor's much longer statement about his ongoing trauma and need for extensive therapy. The judge sentenced Kyle to 7 years in prison. Kyle would be eligible for parole in 4 years. It wasn't enough for what he'd done, but it was something. After sentencing, Lisa told me the civil cases would likely settle now that the criminal conviction was secured. She said Kyle obviously had no money, but insurance companies sometimes paid settlements in these situations. She said I should talk to David about strategy. David had been monitoring the criminal trial and said the verdict helped our position significantly. Kyle had been convicted, which established his liability for damages. The not guilty verdict on attempted sexual assault hurt Trevor's ability to claim maximum damages, but didn't eliminate his claim entirely. David said we should push aggressively for a settlement that gave me an equal share of any recovery from Kyle or his insurance. He said Trevor's credibility had been damaged by his inconsistent testimony, and we could use that leverage. Graham tried one more intimidation tactic. He sent David a letter offering to drop the lawsuit against me if I'd drop my counterclaims and my own lawsuit against Kyle. Essentially, they'd walk away from each other and both pursue Kyle separately. David said this was Graham recognizing his case against me was weak and wanting to eliminate the counterclaims that exposed him and Trevor to liability. David said we should reject the offer and push for a settlement that included payment to me for unpaid rent and damages from Trevor's malicious prosecution. I told David to reject it. Graham responded by escalating discovery. He subpoenaed my employment records, medical records, financial records, phone records, and social media accounts. He was looking for anything that might discredit me or suggest I was exaggerating my damages. David did the same to Trevor. His records showed extensive therapy sessions starting 3 weeks after the break-in and continuing weekly. They also showed social media posts from that same period, showing him at restaurants, parties, and weekend trips with Melissa. David compiled the posts showing Trevor smiling and socializing while claiming to be too traumatized to work or pay rent. The posts contradicted his claims of debilitating psychological injury. Kyle's insurance company finally entered settlement negotiations 10 months after the break-in. The insurer was a homeowner's policy held by the friend whose apartment Kyle had been staying at when arrested. The policy had liability coverage up to $300,000. The insurance company offered to settle all claims for the policy limits if both Trevor and I would release Kyle and agree not to pursue further collection efforts. The $300,000 would be split based on each claimant's damages. Trevor's attorney immediately claimed he deserved the majority since he'd been the direct victim. David argued I'd been equally victimized and had stronger evidence of damages, including unpaid rent, therapy costs I couldn't afford, lost wages from decreased productivity, and emotional distress from being sued maliciously. The insurance company said they'd let a mediator decide the allocation. The mediation took place in a conference room downtown with a retired judge serving as mediator. Trevor attended with Graham and his own civil attorney. I attended with David. Melissa wasn't there. The mediator heard arguments from both sides about how the settlement should be divided. Trevor's attorney presented his therapy records and psychiatric evaluations showing ongoing anxiety and depression. David presented my employment records showing declined performance and warnings from my supervisor, my financial records showing inability to afford therapy, and the social media evidence showing Trevor functioning normally despite his claims. The mediator asked Trevor directly how the break-in had affected his daily life. Trevor said he had nightmares, couldn't sleep, couldn't return to the apartment, had panic attacks in certain situations, and required medication to function. The mediator asked if he was working. Trevor said he'd taken leave from his job, but planned to return soon. The mediator asked how long he'd been on leave. Trevor said 8 months. The mediator asked if he was receiving disability payments. Trevor said his father was supporting him financially. The mediator asked about his social life. Trevor said he'd been trying to maintain normalcy, but it was difficult. The mediator showed him the social media posts David had submitted. Trevor said those posts didn't reflect his internal suffering. The mediator asked me the same questions. I described my sleep problems, hypervigilance, fear of being alone, inability to concentrate, financial stress, and isolation from friends who didn't understand what I was going through. The mediator asked if I was working. I said yes full-time because I had no choice. The mediator asked if I'd sought therapy. I said I couldn't afford it after Trevor stopped paying rent. The mediator asked about my social life. I said I barely had one because I was working constantly to cover expenses and was too exhausted and anxious to socialize. The mediator asked if I'd suffered any physical injuries. I said no, but I'd been the one who fought the intruder while Trevor ran to safety. The mediator took a break to consider the allocation. When she returned, she said both Trevor and I had valid claims for damages, but the evidence showed I'd been more directly impacted in measurable ways. The mediator said Trevor had strong family support and financial resources to aid his recovery, while I'd been forced to manage trauma alone while maintaining employment and fighting off a lawsuit. The mediator proposed allocating $180,000 to me and $120,000 to Trevor. Graham immediately objected, saying this was outrageous, and Trevor was the primary victim. The mediator said if Graham wanted to litigate the allocation, the court would likely consider Trevor's inconsistent testimony, his social media evidence, and his financial advantages, compared to my documented struggles. Graham asked for time to consult with his client. They left the conference room for 20 minutes. When they returned, Graham said they'd accept the allocation on the condition that I'd drop all counterclaims against Trevor and Graham for malicious prosecution. David said no. He said the counterclaims would proceed separately, and if Graham wanted to avoid a judgment against himself and his son, he could settle those claims for the $60,000 in unpaid rent plus my attorney fees. Graham said that was extortion. David said it was accountability. The mediator said she couldn't force settlement on the counterclaims, but recommended both parties consider the costs and risks of continued litigation. Graham asked how much attorney fees I was claiming. David said approximately $40,000 based on hours spent defending against Graham's frivolous lawsuit and prosecuting the counterclaims. Graham said he'd pay the $60,000 in unpaid rent, but wouldn't pay attorney fees. David said then we'd see him in court. Trevor spoke for the first time without being prompted. He said he just wanted this to be over. He said he'd agree to pay the $60,000 and whatever attorney fees were reasonable if I'd dropped the malicious prosecution claims. He said his father had been trying to protect him and things had gotten out of hand. Graham tried to silence him, but he kept talking. He said he knew his memories had changed, and maybe he'd been influenced by therapy and his father's suggestions. He said he didn't want to keep fighting. He just wanted to move on. I looked at Trevor and saw someone who'd been manipulated by his father and his own need to be the sole victim. Someone who'd let lawyers and therapists reconstruct his memories into something more dramatic than reality. Someone who'd convinced himself he deserved more compensation and more sympathy than the person who'd actually saved him. I didn't forgive him, but I understood him. David and I conferred privately. He said we had a strong case for malicious prosecution and could probably win a judgment against both Trevor and Graham. But litigation would take another year or more, and there was always risk in going to trial. The settlement offer would give me $240,000 immediately, plus the satisfaction of making Trevor pay for abandoning his obligations. I asked David what he'd recommend. He said, take the money and end it. Fighting Graham further would be expensive and emotionally draining. I'd won the important battles. I'd been vindicated, compensated, and would walk away in a better position than when I started. I told David to accept the settlement. The final agreement gave me $180,000 from the insurance settlement, $60,000 in unpaid rent from Trevor, and $25,000 in attorney fees negotiated down from $40,000, total of $265,000. Trevor received $120,000 from insurance. After David's contingency fee, I'd net approximately $190,000. Trevor would net approximately $90,000 after his attorney fees. Kyle Brennan would serve 7 years in prison and owe nothing more. The apartment lease was terminated by mutual agreement. I found a new place to live in a better neighborhood with security features that actually worked. I paid for a full year of therapy and started processing everything that had happened. I quit my job at the medical billing company and enrolled in a paralegal certificate program using part of the settlement money. Working with David and Rachel had shown me I was good at understanding legal documents and procedures. The nightmares decreased over time. The hypervigilance remained, but became manageable. I learned to recognize triggers and developed coping strategies. I learned that trauma doesn't follow a timeline, and recovery isn't linear. I learned that some people show their true character in crisis, and others reveal they never had much character to begin with. Trevor sent me one email 6 months after the settlement. He said he was sorry for everything that had happened and hoped I was doing well. He said he was in a better place mentally and was engaged to Melissa. He said he'd learned a lot about himself through therapy and was trying to become a better person. He didn't acknowledge the lawsuit or the money or the betrayal. Just a generic apology that cost him nothing. I didn't respond. 2 years after the break-in, I was working at a law firm as a paralegal specializing in personal injury cases. I helped clients navigate insurance companies and settlement negotiations and civil litigation. I thought about Trevor sometimes, but not often. I thought about Kyle Brennan even less. I'd gotten a notification that he'd been denied parole and would serve at least 2 more years. I'd moved on with my life in ways Trevor apparently hadn't. The settlement money was invested and growing. I had a career I actually cared about instead of a job I tolerated. I had an apartment that felt safe. I had a therapist who'd helped me understand that saving yourself is just as important as saving others. And sometimes the people you save don't deserve it, but you do it anyway because that's who you are. The real justice wasn't the settlement or the criminal conviction or even making Trevor pay what he owed. The real justice was building a life where people like him and Graham couldn't touch me anymore, where I had resources and knowledge and support systems that protected me from predators of all kinds, where I understood my own worth enough not to let anyone diminish it. I'd survived a home invasion and learned that sometimes the person sleeping across the hall is more dangerous than the one breaking through the window. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.